Good afternoon and welcome to Breaking FIDO, our exploits in there. You are in South Seas GH and today's speaker, or this session speaker, is Jared Chong. Just a few brief notes before we start. The business hall is still open this afternoon in Baysides AB until I believe 5 o'clock. The Black Hat Arsenal is also still running in the Palm Foyer on level 3, and the Arsenal reception is this evening at 1700. If you haven't picked up any of your merchandise from the Black Hat store, that would be the time to do it today. They'll be closing soon. And also the Kali Linux Lab is in Mandalay Bay A. As always, please put your phones on vibrate so that we're not disturbed by them. And with that, I will, one last thing. During the Q&A, since this is a recorded session, do please make use of the microphones that are in the aisles. And with that, I will turn it over to Jared.
Thank you. So everybody wants to break FIDO. Me too. I want to do that too. And I'm going to go through a couple of things. So briefing's going to focus on what FIDO is. For some of you who don't know, some of you know. We're going to break down one of the protocols, FIDO U2F. What are the attack vectors that people are looking at? What are the countermeasures? And then some of just practical things that people are doing with this protocol. And then I'm open for questions, I guess, throughout the briefing. So before I go on, who is familiar with what FIDO protocols is? FIDO UAF, U2F, show of hands? About half, okay. So good, it's a good intro to a new authentication protocol that was started some time back, about more than 2 years now, but it actually commercial implementations today. So FIDO's goal is to create a new authentication protocol. And I'll talk a lot about why we need to do that, but we need to separate out user verification from authentication. And some people think that FIDO is a key or biometrics, or no, we are looking at a new plumbing for authentication, and that's a very important concept as we go through this presentation. When we talk about authentication itself, being able to separate from user verification, what it means is that when you do the verification of the user in your authenticator, you can do whatever you want. You can use biometrics or otherwise. But then you should be standardizing what happens after that event, right? So if you think through, even if you did biometrics and you say, great, I've got a great way to verify the user, and then you send some hash value across the wire, and it's an unsalted MD5, doesn't matter how strong your biometrics is, right? So that's an important criteria. And the reason why this is different in its sense is that we're using crypto to fight some of the basic attacks. We're not using like fancy UI and things like that. So we want to use crypto to fight this, right? So the way we know that this can scale is obviously you got to start standardizing on authentication protocols at a level that everyone can implement. You look at the alliance today, it's made up of vendors, platform providers like OS, and then you have relying parties like banks and sites and various services. So this has to scale, this has to make sense at a grand scale. And so the basic concept is public key cryptography. The authenticator has a private key, and it will sign an assertion that the service sends to it. So we're dealing with, yes, private keys and public keys, and a whole bunch of public keys flying around. And then we layer a lot of other things on top of that, right? So this is the basic concept. And some people ask, okay, where does this fit in the grand scheme of things? You know, we talk about authentication, we talk about other technologies that complement or compete. Well, what we're talking about here is a stack where you are standardizing authentication. Most of us are familiar with authentication as username and passwords, of course, and many of you are also familiar with SMS type authentication, OTP, Google Authenticate type authentication. So this is kind of the same vein, but we want to take it one step further, which is how can we do better? How can we do better than what the state is today? So it ties in nicely with federation. I get that question often about what happens to an OAuth token. Well, this is the step before you get the OAuth token. And so I'm going to break down FIDO U2F, and the reason I do that is because there's a lot of open source codes around, and there's a lot of implementations that are fairly transparent, and you can see how people are doing it. And it's the foundation of all the other FIDO authentication specifications that is still being worked on. The basic concept is that if you want to do strong second factor authentication, and U2F stands for Universal Second Factor, you have your primary authentication method, potentially many of you do have this today, is some type of username and password. But if you want to layer strong authentication on top of that, what should that be, right? So we know of the latest NIST guidance on SMS, so I don't want to beat that horse again. But also we need to think of something better that the industry can standardize on. And so some of the entities, as I kind of, before I start breaking things down, I want to make sure we are on the same page, which is there are three elements in the FIDO U2F protocol. We have a server component where the services reside. We have a client, and we have an authenticator. And the client in this sense would be the current implementation we have is a Chrome browser that is live. Everybody can see this live. Services, there are a number of services. I'll talk about those in a bit. And then the authenticator, which there are also a number of authenticators available on the market. And we're talking about three transports. And this, I want to just highlight the three transports because it will be relevant to some of the attacks that you will hear that I talk about. The transports, they're kind of the approved transports in a second factor perspective, or what we want to deem as using something else outside the compute device is USB, NFC, and Bluetooth. So these are the basic components. So quick kind of overview on the protocol, and we'll start to go deeper on these things. But essentially, during the registration process, your device, your authenticator, would generate a key pair, and it would really release back the public key to the service through the client. This is a very important concept that is important to know because you are actually generating unique key pairs per service. So from a scale perspective, it's quite significant. I'm focusing a lot on kind of the attack vectors. So there are other elements of the FIDO protocol that talks about privacy and other scaling abilities. I'll go into some of them, but not a whole ton of those. So when you do the authentication, what you're going to have to do is to send a challenge, and the device, the authenticator, would sign it. And so you would think through the case whereby you are signing the challenge for the right service. So this is a kind of basic concept. I'll go through most of all these parameters in next set of slides. But so let's talk about what's the state of the nation today, right? So this is a sad state. We all know this is a sad state. And this is happening again and again and again, and we are still in the sad state. So session replays are very common, right? I mean, cookie replay, I mean, that's just, we know that. But it's not just passwords, right? I mean, if you think about what we're trying to solve here is that we've got a symmetric key problem. You've got it's a shared key problem, right? You've got entity 1 versus entity 2, someone generating something, someone verifying it, and you've got some shared key. So anytime when you have that type of system, all it takes is one party to reveal the secret and everybody's like lost, right? So when we build a protocol, we have to address this very big factor. And it's not just from the user's perspective that's super annoying that you got to write codes and passwords and all these things. These are the basic idea of let's improve the state of how we talk about the cryptography of authentication protocols. So right off the bat, protocol takes care of the first two basic things, in my opinion, for an authentication protocol. Challenge response. Challenge response required to every authentication session is a unique session, right? So the challenge is a WebSafe base 64 string that you generate as a service, and then you get that over to the client. The client knows what to do, and it sends it over to the authenticator, and the authenticator would then sign. And how would it know what to sign? The device would have the ability to use a reference, a key handle, to say use this private key to sign for this service. There's various ways that people implemented different ways in terms of how they get the private key. Some people do a wrap key implementation. Some people do a derived key implementation to get the private key. But in essence, you're getting back the private key and you're signing it. Right? So chance response takes care of that replay. The other thing that we want to take care of is a scalable attack on hashes. Whether you're talking about your password database just being SHA-1 or MD5 or something like that, we want to move away from that, right? So now the services will have a whole bunch of public keys, it's true, but what can you do with the public keys, right? So we've eliminated a couple of big things here using this model of public key cryptography. Okay, so that's great. We've kind of solved that first two big buckets. So what's the next big bucket? This is a big bucket that I think there's been so many talks in the last 2 days on this topic, phishing. And so in this event, if you've managed to get someone to go to a bad website and you manage to phish the username and password, the next step isn't very difficult, right? To just say, okay, you're going to receive an SMS, please type it in. You have your authenticator, please type it in. I mean, if you really fool the user to do the first 2 steps, this is not a difficult problem to solve. And so this is phishing is as we know, this is really a low skill, low cost attack, right? This is not, you don't need to hire a good crypto hacker. You just hire a good web developer, and you're good, right? Front page developer. Someone that can write really good emails. You're in business. So we need to stop this. We really need to stop this. And you've been to the conference. There are various companies trying to solve this in different ways. But why not solve it in the authentication protocol? Why not have the protocol take care of this? So you don't care of what the user does. You don't have to assume the user is going to do the right thing. So what we're talking about is that phishing is effective. We need to put a stop to this. We can find out all various schemes to create a better way to do either second-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. But let's talk about what we're trying to do to actually solve it in the protocol. So this is a good concept. So I'm bringing 3 important parameters in this protocol that I want to highlight. They're all very relevant. The challenge, as we talked about, this is unique. It's a unique nonce. You have an origin. Origin is, for most parts, the web origin, where this is coming from, where the service is starting the assertion. And the channel ID, and I'll go to channel ID in a little bit. But this is an important criteria to stop the attacks that I just talked about, phishing. So if we bound the signature of the assertion to the origin, then you take away one effective thing, which is that the attacker needs to really steal and be the origin. And it's a very hard problem, right? I mean, you can talk about DNS spoofing and all these other attacks, but it's tougher. It's much tougher, right? To take, for example, you got a webmail, and you use Gmail, and it's a tough problem. So you're going to steal, the domain of Gmail. It's really hard. Right? Not to say impossible, but now you took the attack vector. You've increased the cost. And the second thing with this, the protocol, what it does is there's a requirement for physical presence of the authenticator to the actual device, and that's important, right? Because if you have the authenticator that can communicate with your authentication server somewhere very, very far away and do other proxies, I don't really know that the authenticator is really talking to my device that I'm trying to log into. So the presence of the authenticator within the proximity of the compute device is a critical element to break the scalable phishing attacks. And I'll put like, generated OTPs that you send in a phishable sense because you're delivering that to some channel that you really don't know whether it was you who initiated it or the attacker who initiated it. So if you look at this case, if you did a phish on even a push technology, which is kind of the hot buzz right now, how do you know the push is for you and not the attacker to store the username and password and just send you a quick, nice picture that says, hey, you're going to receive a nice little push here, please touch it. You don't know that, right? Because the authenticator could be communicating to the service in an out-of-band manner. So that's why we locked this down into the protocols in terms of the really focus into the 3 transport protocols. Intent of the authentication event is you physically talking to the event here, and that's important. So looking at the protocol, the origin is really the critical part of this flow here to break the phishing type of scenario, which means that there's a big heavy weight on the client because the client now got to translate and make that right doing the communication to the authenticator, right? So the origin is part of the flow, and the device will sign it so that the service can verify that it's coming from itself. Now, you could argue that, you know what, I could sign for the wrong origin, so what happens? I could sign for the badass acme.com site. That's fine, right? I mean, like, you can't use that to log in to acme.com. You can't use it because it's for acme.com, right? So you break that pretty quickly. So you guys are like, okay, great, now we've talked about phishing, but I really want to talk about some serious stuff. I want to talk about like breaking TLS and stuff. So yes, one thing that you guys will ask is, you know, fine, you got to talk about authentication protocols and you're depending on the web and what's the base? Yes, it's over TLS. That's true. We don't want to create new transports for communicating to websites. It's just not the way to go. The way I look at it is that, yes, there are going to be vulnerabilities in SSL, and then we moved to TLS, now it's 1.3, and there are going to be things, but people are looking at this stuff, right? So you've got to base it on something that makes sense. But of course, you can do interceptions. You can find heartbleed type attacks. You can find beast attacks. You can hey, even CAs are going to be compromised. So why are we basing it on TLS? So there's obviously a lot of advancements within TLS in itself that is necessary. And one of the elements that I'll talk about next is the token binding effect. But regarding this attack, so going and getting the client, getting the challenge, and putting the origin in, and asking to sign, and then that flow, the flow this way is pretty hard, right? Service to device, that flow is hard to break. I mean, if you assume things are in place. You can say, great, that's great, but I'm just going to get you on the back way, right? I'm just going to get you on the way back, because once you sign it and I get the signature, I'm in business, right? I get the assertion, and I'm like, yes, I'll go exchange the assertion for a cookie. Yes, I'm done, right? So yes, that's definitely a possible attack, because going that way is hard, right? You assume I talk about the user presence, the device got to be closed, and all these things. So the flow going this way is going to be really hard. And just get it on the back end. Just get him just before he sends it to the service, you get the assertion, and then you do a swap, right? So that's definitely possible. And so we want to solve this in the protocol as well. And again, this is industry effort here. So I'll jump into a concept that some of you are familiar, maybe some of you are not familiar. Who's familiar with channel ID, token binding? Anyone? Oh, very few. Oof, okay. So basic concept. This doesn't just apply to FIDO. This applies to anything that is a token-based system. So you can think of a cookie, you can think of a OAuth token. You can bind those. You can bind those to the client. And so what essentially you're doing is that the client is generating and this is outside FIDO, right? The client generates a key pair, and it gives it the token binding protocol message says, hey, from now on, whatever I'm passing you, let's use a binding, a token binding ID. And the token binding ID is essentially a hash of the public key that's talking to the service. So what's happening now is that every time you are doing a assertion or receiving tokens and things like that, the server knows I'm binding the session, really this is called a TLS session, you bind the session to the client. You can think of like origin bound pairing. So this gives you confidence that you really have to break the client and you have to break the server. It's not just one way. And even if you got the assertion on the back end, this assertion was meant for this client. If you're an attacker's system, if you got your own client, then you don't have that. You don't have the private key that is on the user's client. So we want to introduce token binding. The channel binding was there because there were a couple of parallel efforts that was happening when we created the protocol. It was channel binding before, now it's token binding. It's an IETF. It's draft 8 right now. So we're getting very close. We hope that this will get RFC by the end of the year, and everybody will be very familiar with this. But this concept applies to much wider than the FIDO protocol. And I encourage you to review this. It has many good implications for other use cases. But essentially what we're doing now is that we bind the FIDO assertion, right? And we make it so that this is bound for that service with the client. And when you get that situation, even if you stole the assertion, you can't use it on your client. So channel ID token binding is there. So you bind, remember I talked about the client parameters, which is the challenge, the origin, and the channel ID. So we put this in the specification so that when you sign it, you get all three. Signed and returned. Okay. So, okay, we've kind of had some attack countermeasure scenarios going here. Then you're going to ask me, okay, so now the client, right? So great, you've kind of solved some of the big picture things. What about the client? So the client has to do this. And so now we think about the client is doing a lot of heavy lifting. So it's important that we get the client right. We talk about origin, we talk about the channel ID mismatch, and we talk about all these things that your browser will guarantee to the service. So what happens when the browser is compromised? Or when the client is compromised? Bad things happen. Bad things happen. So the protocol really cannot address this factor when you've got some rootkit in your device and then you do all kinds of malicious things. It can't do this, but if you think through that use case, if I've done so much bad stuff, why even bother stealing an assertion? Why bother even getting authentication? Just read the email straight. I mean, who cares, right? But the goal here is that I want people to think about the problem that we're trying to solve, which is like, if we do things right, when the things that we do right does well, we should not be susceptible to low-level, low-scale, low-cost attacks, right? So, I mean, we talk about this scenario about obviously Chrome being the first FIDO U2F client. I mean, we're talking about attacking a platform that has a lot of eyes on this, right? And a lot of resources that the team at Google, and by the way, we definitely work with the Google folks here. So there's a high bar as well, right? I mean, 0 day on Chrome, I wouldn't say it's not there, but it's a high bar. But one thing we need to understand is that the protections around the ecosystem of the device doesn't mean that we can, like if your front door, your lock can be broken, do you mean that you don't lock your front door, right? I mean, this is this basic concepts here. So yes, there is a venue of attack. If the client is in bad shape, then things become bad, right? You can do a number of things when you've kind of compromised the client. Because I've just described to you, like everything is based on how the client is handling the things. And I would say, you got to leave, building the FIDO client, you got to leave things to the professional in most cases. I think that that's an important lesson. And so when we talk about this protocol, the ecosystem is really focused on the right people building the right FIDO clients for the rest of us versus the entire world trying to build FIDO clients. Not to say you can't. You can, of course. But there's an element of trust involved. And the trust is very significantly impacted if you have a bad client. So, but one thing that I do want to mention is that we talk about the client, but there's another attack vector as well. You could talk about the authenticator as well, right? So what's a scalable authenticator attack? Stealing the private keys, right? So stealing the private keys is a scalable attack. If SSH keys on your laptop, anyone? So that is a possible scenario, right? So nothing in the specification says that it has to be hardware. It can be software. It can be anything you want, essentially. But the elements that we want to think about for a scalable attack is that when you start to be able to massively harvest private keys, that is a scalable attack. So one thing we did, I don't think this is by far the golden ticket for solving this, but there's a parameter in here that helps with that. I wouldn't say this is like the gold standard, but there's a counter value that the authenticator would increment as a global value. So you would know if someone's reusing the same assertion on the authenticator if you're cloning the private keys. So that's one element. Obviously, using it on devices, hardware-backed keys gives you a higher level of confidence. You could think of, there's so many of them out there in terms of trusted storage of keys, secure enclave, TE, secure elements, TPM, you can name it. So obviously, those are best practices. So it's hard to extract those. Okay, so kind of changing gears a little bit, I want to just quickly focus on some things related to the ability of us to think about attack where you've want to enable two-factor authentication. So today the world is all opt-in. I like to see a world where it's not opt-in. And like you can't buy something unless you've already registered with some strong authentication method. That'll be a good day for all of us. So this is a simple denial of service attack on the user, right? You get that before they set up the strong auth, and then you lock them out. I mean, this is going to be more prevalent as we get the FIDO protocol and implementations out there. So definitely something to be aware. And then we talk about this notion of how do we start this process? One of the great things about passwords, it's so portable. So we run a gamut of kind of risk-based analysis, and then we say, okay, all these other devices are not secure to log in. You can only log in this one. But there's always going to be some cases where you have to log into some device that's not yours. And what did we do there? So we need to think about a scenario whereby the bootstrap mechanism is something that is as strong. Because what's happening right now is that we are going towards a scenario where you have the front doors very strong and the back doors are just wide open. And when you do a recovery, you're just not doing something that you believe in. And it goes back down to the transports as well. So I think that's kind of all tied in together. We need to think about the recovery flow. We need to think about the backup flow. If you have everything FIDO enabled on your primary device, what happens if you go to your secondary device? What happens next? And then I think this is kind of obvious from a lot of discussions, which is if we focused efforts on just talking about strong authentication without talking about strong recovery, then we are in a very bad place. The attackers just move. They just move the attacks from phishing your primary credentials to phishing your recovery credentials. So this is important, and that's why I think the ecosystem needs to think about the attack vectors as it comes from implementing the entire life cycle of how the user uses the device, both from onboarding, first registration, backup device, recovery. So you're going to ask me, okay, so what's been done? What's been done today, and what's different about this approach? Well, we've seen smart cards that certain nations in the world has been fairly successful, but hasn't at a global scale hasn't really taken off. They are obviously inherent nature. We believe that smart cards is strong, but to expect everybody to carry around a reader is not a good recommendation. especially when we deal with the B2C. Now, I do want to premise that most of my discussion has been focused on the B2C, when where you as a service or a company providing services to your consumers, but this is applicable to internal deployments and your B2B environments. It's all the same kind of set of requirements. And we think about it from the perspective of why we don't really want to do systems with symmetric keys. If you think about phishing is because we are dealing with a scenario where you have a symmetric key, and that's like OTP as well, right? So you could have a whole huge OTP database that could be compromised. And if you know the algorithm, you know how to decrypt the OTP. So that's definitely a concern in the industry, having the current state they were in, especially on the SMS perspective. So I'll give you a little bit background on SMS just so we know the attacks on that. There are three main attacks. The backbone attack when you roam, right, is a store and send. So that's one attack there. But there's also the ability for simple malware to do SMS transfers. And then the last of SMS is just being able to phish. So I think we need to think about that every time we talk about second factor strong authentication. Not all multi-factor is equal. Not all second factor, not all ways to do authentication is equal. So I want to summarize a little bit. My session was actually 25 minutes. I've got approval to go beyond, so I'm talking a little bit more. But I wanted to share with you on where I think the industry is needed here. There are obviously known vulnerabilities in these other types of strong authentication. But what we need to focus on is new plumbing, and that's what this is about. So the pictures on the right are services that have implemented the protocol. I encourage you to try them out, test them out, and continue to break things. And I think that the goal is to rethink about the architecture we are building for authentication. And it doesn't just start with stop at web applications. It starts with pretty much every single vendor downstairs that produce products to think about this like today. If you are logging into your threat analysis, monitoring, super highly sensitive box with a static password, that's a problem. So one of the things that I think we need to do is to really push the needle on this, which is like people building products, both for enterprise and consumers, need to seriously think of the plumbing problem that we are in today, which is back to the first thing I said, which is like reuse, session replay, those type of attacks. Those are the basics. We're still digging our hole deeper in that aspect, because every product that we release, every new web app, web service is stuck in this world. So we do need to make a dent in this. I'd like to open up some questions on protocols or otherwise. Anyone? Last slide, how to get started. We've got a number of resources. So question? Yeah.
The key pair that is generated for a particular origin, does it use RSA keys or DSA keys, ECDSA keys?
Good question. So the key pairs, we are using the NIST curves, ECC P256. Yeah. And you're going to say, oh, NIST curves, ECC, oh my God, quantum computing attacks. And so guys, we've got to start somewhere, right? Let's just be honest here. We've got to start somewhere. Specifications change. I mean, if you think through where we are today, this is the second year that the specifications out, and we've got these implementations out, right? So we're in a good place. There's a lot of ongoing work. There's tons of ongoing work with a number of parallel things going on. Definitely this has been discussed. Yes, there's work to be done. We can improve. We can have better curves. We can have all your nice curves, but we got to start somewhere. I do want to mention one other area. So one of the things that we've done now in where we are in the specifications is that we've done the FIDO U2F specifications. We've now actually moved a number of all the, what we deemed as the web APIs into the W3C organization. And so W3C means pretty much anybody building a browser will participate in that ecosystem. And so that's a good thing. I think that's a very good thing. The question is about when are other FIDO clients going to be enabled. I would say that over the next 6 months, you're going to be seeing a lot more coming out in the market. Your favorite browser, your favorite OS, things like that. So the OS vendors have made a conscious effort that we need to unite in this so that the rest of us can implement with the right APIs, right? Because if everybody's building their own thing, it's going to be hard. So there needs to be some control. And I think there's a good agreement between the good folks at Google and Microsoft to come to a way that the industry can work together. And I think that's needed. I think part of why you're here is to not just know about attacks, but to know about new collaboration efforts by the industry to solve big problems. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I think a lot of people need to analyze the protocol more, which is why first step is to know that this exists and you can do your homework. But then after that is to participate and contribute. Because this is a big effort by a lot of individual organizations, but no one organization can solve this. Yes?
Have you heard of other implementation on, say, Safari and Firefox? Are they coming or?
So the question was about what are the other browsers doing. So I'm not speaking for them, but here's what I know if you do your Google searching. Firefox is in process. I know that. I'm not going to commit the day, but it is in process. Opera's latest 40 has, the nightly has implemented U2F as well. So it's getting there. It's getting there. So I'm hoping that by the end of the year we will have at least 3 or 4, depending on how we get FIDO things into the Microsoft wall. And then we are in a pretty good shape for starting off 2017, which is then there's very little reason why web services and web apps should not implement this, right? In terms of OSs, I'm not going to speak on behalf of Apple. It is one of those things where hoping that the W3C movement will, as a standardized platform for all browsers to communicate their requirements, will get that done. And then it's up to them. So the right approach is to have a standard approach that people can see, break, and continue to analyze, and then people adopt. Because if we are going into this dark age again of building authentication protocols that are proprietary, we know where we are today. If not, I thank you for your time.